All right, thank you everyone for joining us today, whether you're sort of on the East Coast, West Coast, or over somewhere in Europe or Asia. I appreciate your time. For those who aren't familiar with us at Radiant Vision Systems, we are a metrology equipment manufacturer who specializes in 2D imaging photometers and colorimeters. One of the unique things about Radiant Vision Systems is we're actually part of the Konica Minolta family of sensing products. A couple of years ago, we were actually acquired by Konica Minolta, and that has given us a strong push from a branding perspective, but also has given the company the legs it needed to expand into a variety of different applications. Looking at a specific application today, which is going to be characterizing sparkle over AG films, AR films, and coatings, this is an area where we've been able to develop our expertise sort of thanks to that additional boost that we received by being acquired by such a great company. So if we look at Radiant as a whole, we have a variety of different offices sort of located around the world. Radiant's headquartered in Seattle, Washington, well, technically Redmond, but we have a variety of different offices around the world as well: Shanghai, Shenzhen, Seoul, and we have a strong distributor network through our KM partnership. So a lot of you who are on this webinar already have either been introduced to our KM partners or have met us in person. But for those who are new, I appreciate your time and thank you for joining, and look forward to learning more about your potential applications. So the agenda today, as I mentioned, is really going to focus on looking and characterizing anti-glare, anti-reflective films over a variety of different type of display technologies. So we'll go through basically the premise, the background of the application for looking at anti-glare displays. We'll look at the effect that sparkle has on these displays. We'll go through the different measurement criteria that we need to consider when trying to characterize sparkle. Then we'll look at the thing that separates the Radiant system from the other solutions that exist on the market, and that's the ability to define a measurement standard and method. So we'll go through what's required from a system specification standpoint, the measurement setup, the software requirements, and then basically defining a quality standard that, let's say, an automotive OEM might look for to doll out to, let's say, their tier 1s or tier 2s. And how our cameras correlate to human perception. At the end, we'll talk very briefly about a success story where we've had great feedback and traction looking at automotive displays from a sparkle analysis standpoint. So let's get into the sort of meat and bones of this presentation. So anti-glare displays, background and effect on visual display quality. So when we think about displays, especially consumer electronic displays, we look at the ability that they're very mobile. We can sort of take a consumer electronic cell phone as an example, and we can orient it in different ways, meaning that ambient light or direct sunlight sort of hitting that display and reflecting off it can be minimized, since we can control the orientation in which we observe the information. That said, anti-glare coatings, anti-reflective coatings are actually becoming more prominent or of interest in consumer electronics as well. But where we see a large issue right now is sort of in the automotive or aerospace industry, where displays are fixed. Meaning if we look at a center stack display as an example in an automotive vehicle, that information needs to be easily readable and needs to be conceived in a very proper and quick way. The issue is those displays go through a variety of different ambient conditions, which involve many different types of reflections. What we want to look at when we talk about automotive displays as an example is how do display manufacturers mitigate and cut down on those large reflections while still being able to display the appropriate information that the driver needs to see, as an example. Same thing can be said for aerospace. When we look at displays that use anti-glare films or anti-reflective films, we're looking at a layer coating that's been applied to the display that creates sort of like a spectral-like mirror reflection over the glass or plastic. The anti-glare coatings are actually a micro pattern or a roughened surface on the substrate that can immediately be looked at from a diffusive situation and a breakdown of the reflected light that scatters across the surface. The diffusion that we look at here basically is in coherence with the reflected image, making these unwanted images or unfocused images to the eye look sort of muddied or dulled. A beautiful high-resolution display can go from a clear, visible state to a very blurry, low-quality situation with the wrong type of anti-glare, anti-reflective coatings. This is why characterizing them becomes quite important. both from a human perspective standpoint, but also from a quantitative standpoint. So here we show two images, one on the left, which is obviously an LCD without any type of anti-glare, anti-reflective film or coating. The one on the right-hand side has this technology applied. As you can easily see, there is, as the technology, or as the issue is called, sparkle, is very clear. You see multiple colors sort of scattering and light being diffused over the surface of the display in many different angular perspectives. This is what truly needs to be characterized. So when we look at the anti-glare microstructure, which sort of acts as a lensing aspect to the pixels within the display, this is truly what needs to be characterized. The principal drawback to using an anti-reflective coating or film is that it diffuses a variety of different mechanisms over sort of the reflection pattern of the LCD surface itself, which means we sacrifice clarity and we sacrifice a variety of different resolutions. Depending on how large, let's say, the pixel size might be, we can actually induce larger amounts of scatter over the specific display itself. So we'll talk about going through the aspects of characterizing that and the requirements that need to be set forth. So sparkle occurs when the AG surface structure competes with the pixel geometry of the display. As display pixels near the size of the facets in the AG film structure, the light emitted from each display pixel is refracted by the AG surface variations that cross the pixel area, causing interference and scatter. Since we look at a lot of displays from an RGB layer, we get each one of the channels refracting in different directions, which causes this multicolor sparkling aspect within the display. Optimizing the AG layer is an extremely important and sort of delicate balance that tier 3s, tier 2s, tier 1s sort of through the display product lifecycle need to consider. Obviously, display manufacturers want to maximize the diffusion of light so that way they can operate their displays in a variety of different ambient scenarios. However, they also need to look at minimizing the impact of using these anti-reflective films to reduce the sparkle in the image itself to ensure that a quality image is actually being perceived. So when we talk about measuring sparkle, we're actually looking at the pixel level luminance variation that is calculated as a standard deviation over a variety of different portions of the display. When we characterize sparkle, we actually output a specific percentage value. That percentage value is telling you what the variation is in that quadrant, and we'll talk about it a little more. But as you can see in this slide, there are multiple quadrants that have been broken up over the display, each one of them being characterized individually, giving us a region of interest to understand the specific section of the display and the variation happening throughout. So let's jump into measurement considerations. So what's the objective here for evaluating a display? Well, first off, we want to be able to define our measurement system, define the measurement setup, isolate the specific sparkle, and then look to understand that percentage value that I just talked about in the previous slide for the standard deviation and correlate that directly to human perception. One of the things that we recommend through using our solution is actually performing an initial human evaluation study, and we'll talk about that more throughout this presentation. The benefit of our solution is that we correlate to human perception. Human eyes are very responsive to a variety of different light, and we can quickly see and determine when we think that there's abnormalities inside a display. And we'll talk about those studies a little more as we go through, but the important part here is understanding how a human can perceive a potential defect or a potential abnormality and how the radiant system actually allows you to correlate that from a quantitative standpoint. So one of the advantages we can employ to achieve more effective display characterization is accounting for display gradients, a common issue in displays which can cause unreliability in sparkle measurement data. Because the standard deviation is used to calculate the pixel level luminance variation AG displays or AR displays, broad gradient changes across the display must be normalized to achieve accurate measurements. Where no gradient is present, the standard deviation for luminance variation is calculated accurately across the display using a min and max luminance value. When a gradient is present across the display, the standard deviation is calculated inaccurately because the min and max values characterizing the gradient end up being rather large from a luminance variation standpoint. When we look at characterizing the display, a lot of the times when you use a full field of view imaging photometer or imaging colorimeter, you end up actually acquiring more information than just the display itself. So an important part of this measurement process is mitigating the surrounding information and actually removing it from the measurement method itself. Radiant has a cropping technology that we call register active display area. And what it does is it allows us to pinpoint the four corners of the emitting display, look at the image, rectify it and normalize it, and remove the surrounding information. By removing the surrounding and background information, we can properly look at the information we care about in the display surface itself, normalizing its position, looking at things like luminance and chromaticity, and obviously in this situation, running our sparkle measurement algorithm to understand the sparkle variation inside the display itself. But for those who are very familiar with displays, we know that there sometimes can be a variety of different types of defects or abnormalities that end up being present in the display. And many people that I've talked to in the past have wondered, how do we look at isolating that information? Well, what's really nice is that Radiant, we have a variety of different tools that allow us to sort of remove some of this background information that may potentially skew our measurement data. One of the examples is sort of a blob removal tool, where in this image you can see we've highlighted some of the mura that might be present in the display, and we're actually looking to mask it out from the initial image. From there, we can run our sparkle algorithm and characterize the display without looking at how these abnormalities might potentially be affecting the display. That said, obviously that's not a process that you necessarily have to go through. We have many people who are involved in sparkle measurements or different types of films or displays that actually want to have this information involved in the overall characterization process. Radiant just gives you the flexibility to look at it from two different perspectives. When we talk about sparkle, a lot of the times we're actually looking just at the luminance variation. But as sparkle has become a more interesting topic sort of in the display world, whether we're talking about automotive, aerospace, or consumer electronics, color analysis and how different colors affect the sparkle variation has become very apparent and of interest to many of the customers that we deal with right now. So by using an imaging colorimeter, so a tri-stimulus filter-based system that correlates tri-stimulus values to CIE, XY space, we can actually look at how red, green, blue, white displays actually affect the variation of sparkle and how that responds directly to the human eye over different types of lighting conditions. To be able to get accurate measurements, though, you need a properly calibrated device. One of the advantages is Radiant has released a variety of new calibration technologies. These calibration technologies allow us to properly identify and characterize displays under different lighting environments, but also under different color conditions to ensure that we get accurate CX, CY, or U prime values, which then allow us to properly correlate that information to a sparkle analysis where color variation might be important to the measurement process. So let's talk about sort of evaluation based on human perception and how we go about defining the tolerance over potential several participants. The sparkle measurement methods do not obtain measurement values correlated to human perception of display quality based on a golden sample. So what I mean by that is there's a variety of different technologies that exist today. The ones that are currently on the market require you to look at a golden sample solution and compare each individual sample to that initial DUT. Radiant's solution is a little different, where we actually base it on human perception and not the golden sample rule. So what we want to look at is how do humans perceive the display, as I mentioned earlier, and how do we quantify that perception from a statistical standpoint that is useful to, let's say, automotive OEMs or consumer electronic manufacturers, so they can talk to their different tiers of customers on how to mitigate some of the issues that might be present by using these different types of technologies over their displays. So the next couple slides is actually going to go through the process of defining the tolerance from a case-by-case perspective based on human perception and then correlation directly to the imaging photometer, imaging colorimeter itself. So creating the standard method. So I mentioned earlier in this presentation that Radiant specializes in 2D imaging photometers and imaging colorimeters. So this is the primary technology that's involved in actually going through the measurement process. You need a photometrically calibrated device using a CCD sensor, something with a variety of different resolution options that adheres to a specific defined measurement setup. So in this situation, we've gone through probably a year of development testing with a variety of different customers, and what we identified was that to get accurate results, you need to follow a specific procedure. And the procedure we've laid out is sort of using anywhere from a 2 megapixel to 29 megapixel imaging photometer colorimeter, depending on if you care about color or not from a sparkle perspective, ensuring that you at least have a 1-to-1 pixel sort of correlation. You want to use a system that is thermoelectrically cooled, like the I or Y series, to ensure that low noise floor is being present in the image. If you end up having a poor signal to noise ratio, you could end up inducing additional artifacts into the measurement itself, which could actually skew the sparkle percentage value variation that we're looking at. Again, I mentioned looking at a factory calibration, so something that is NIST traceable as an example. And the lens that we actually recommend for this measurement setup is the 50mm electronically controlled lens. And we'll talk about that a little further. Then we have the software platform. So this is basically the workhorse of where the data acquisition and analysis is happening, where we define our test sequencing setup, we go through our focus, we talk about RADA, or we use RADA, as I mentioned earlier. We go through the different characteristics for looking at gradient filters or blob removal, and basically we end up with a finalized report showing the information that we've gone through the characterization process for, and in this situation obviously would be sparkle variation. Setting up the measurement is an important process. So one of the fundamental issues with other technologies that exist today is that the manufacturers of those technologies haven't defined a proper process, meaning that as you go from system to system or customer to customer, there's large variability because no standard has been put in place to ensure customers get repeatable and accurate data from system to system, site to site, technology to technology. This is something that Radiant decided we had to quickly address if we wanted to actually present a valid solution. One of the things that is important is the alignment process, so we'll go through what that looks like at this point. In this slide, we're basically showing that we've adhered or locked down the imaging colorimeter to a breadboard, but honestly, we could use an XYZ stage as an example, or a very sort of ruggedized tripod as an example. Something that just allows you proper horizontal vertical tilt and gives you proper alignment feedback, because perpendicularity is extremely important to this measurement process. We want to define a working distance, and this is probably one of the most essential parts of the measurement method, is figuring out what a repeatable working distance is from the display to the camera itself, and ensuring that that information is properly conceived, set up, and that methodology for measurement setup has been sort of characterized and defined. And this is something that Radiant has spent a lot of time going through and ensuring that we find the right working distance that meets a variety of different applications. So if we think about the standard that we've created for this application, it actually involves the camera and the device under test being 0.5 meters apart from each other. So basically, when we say we're looking at half a meter, we're basically looking at the display itself to the CCD plane, which, as you can see in this slide, is located slightly behind the black bezeling of the casing of the camera itself. This information is actually input into our software in a focus mode that then gets saved and applied to the sort of calibration platform for the measurement acquisition. So once we have our system sort of set up, we need to look at proper alignment. For those who are familiar with the DFF Black Murrah standard, you'll know that that standards body committee has come up with a very intuitive way to look at alignment, where basically you ensure that you have, axial rotations of less than 0.5 degrees on a horizontal tilt and vertical tilt, as well as an XY variation of less than 0.1 millimeters. Our software does a really great and intuitive thing by defining different points within the display to help with that orientation and alignment. So here in this slide, we borrow a process from the DFF Black Murrah alignment procedure to actually help us properly align the imaging colorimeter or photometer. So as you can see, there's a grid-based pattern that's being presented, and this is something we recommend. And what's nice is the Radiant TrueTest software can actually drive this pattern directly to your display. So this is not something you need to create on your own. This is something the software provides you as a default. By aligning the camera to the display, what the software will do is it'll actually go through and look at those 5 different points, and it will acquire them and map them out. And what it'll do is it'll give us our horizontal offset information, as you can see in this slide. So if you look at the pattern setup, you have adjustment of pattern, you have horizontal offset, vertical offset, our horizontal and vertical rotations, and axial rotations. This allows us to understand the perpendicularity of the camera to the display itself. Once we've achieved appropriate alignment, we can go through and look at sort of what the measurement process or focus process looks like. So we've achieved alignment, and now we want to double check sort of our focus alignment procedure. So again, we can open up our focus mode, which we're not showing here in this slide, but is just a small radial dial box that gives you information from a live preview perspective on what the camera sees and what you see on the emitting display. So once we ensure that we are in a proper focus procedure, we can actually go through and look at characterizing the display. One of the important things that we want to look at from an initial standpoint is actually driving the display in a green state. So as I mentioned before, Radiant's imaging photometers or colorimeters, and colorimeters in this case, use CIE matched color filters to adjust the amount of red, green, and blue light that the camera actually receives. It is scientifically proven that the human's response to light from a green perspective is strongest, which means we see the largest amount of variation actually happening over green emitting displays. That said, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily the only color display that you should be looking at, but it is the primary process of setup for analysis using our solution, especially when you're looking at human correlation. I mentioned earlier that we want to look at removing basically the surrounding information around the display itself. But another important process is actually ensuring that the ambient light in the measurement room itself or in the measurement setup has been removed completely. We need to be looking at dark state environments, whether that is a dark lab as an example, or whether it's a controlled box or fixture, which many of you are using today rather than dedicating space to full-on labs. Controlling that ambient light application is an important process of this measurement method. So using the sparkle measurement setup in the software, we can now look at taking an initial measurement. And taking an initial measurement requires a couple steps. The first step is actually adjusting the exposure of the camera to detect the light being emitted from the display. Radiant uses an algorithm that's called auto adjust. Auto adjust allows the camera to basically perceive the signal and the light being emitted from the display, ensure that a 75% saturation level is being met, and then defining what the appropriate exposure time is. This removes human error by trying to manually decide what the best exposure time is based on the human perception of the perceived light. Radiant removes that aspect and allows the camera to identify the light, set the exposure time, and take an accurate measurement. When we're looking at just the luminance level of the measurement itself, we're only talking about the Y filter. But if we want to go through the color characterization process, we would use our X, XB, and Z filters as well, and the same process would be achieved, where the camera would be exposed over the 4 different filters, identify the appropriate exposure time, and then actually go through the acquisition process of the measurement itself. Once we've taken a measurement, the software will actually look at characterizing the static image. So there's 2 ways that we can go about this. One, we can look at creating a variety of different regions of interest over the entire display. So we could break the entire display out into a variety of different quadrants, each quadrant being a region of interest that we're looking for sparkle variation throughout the display. However, there have been a variety of different studies done that state that you don't actually need to look at the entire display. You can actually look at basically the center point, use a subframing tool that exists within the software, define basically the size of your subframe, and in this situation we recommend sort of 500 by 500 pixels, and actually go through that characterization process itself. From a time perspective, there's a small advantage, but overall, that's not the true benefit. It comes down to being able to create repeatable applications and measurement processes. And this is actually the reason that many of our customers have decided to look at subframing the center point of their field of view rather than actually looking at the entire display as a whole. Here's an example of what that area looks like. So if we go through the subframing tool within the software, we can input basically our 500 by 500 pixel area, crop it to the display, and then break it out into 9 specific quadrants. These 9 specific quadrants are each being looked at and have our sparkle algorithm being run against them. However, we're not just looking at breaking out the individual quadrants. We want to be able to provide the user with the information over all 9. So we spit out 9 specific points, but then also give you the mean value of those 9 quadrants. So using the defined measurement method, the image analysis function is accomplished by using what we call actually the random Murrah algorithm. This is our true test sparkle algorithm, just under sort of a different name. This algorithm calculates the standard deviation, as I had mentioned, using the luminance to evaluate variation between the CCD pixels for a number of regions of interest within the user-defined measurement area. The final result ends up giving us a standard deviation across the entire display from a pixel to pixel scenario. Once we've achieved that information, as I mentioned earlier, we actually get a sparkle variation percentage. This tells us how much sparkle is actually being achieved within the display itself. And as we look at displays that have larger amounts of sparkle variation, that number increases. And we'll talk about that a little more going through the following slides. So defining acceptable tolerances. So to define a sparkle measurement, the values we need to look at are sort of what is acceptable from a display quality perspective. An initial study that we actually performed with a couple different OEMs in the automotive space, as well as internal development, has allowed us to create sort of a benchmarking test platform that different suppliers can use based on human observers and a variety of different displays that sort of exist within that technology platform. So the next slides basically show what we had originally characterized sort of in our lab. So we took 10 different human observers, and what we did was we presented them with 3 different displays, and we had them basically rate the displays based on sort of a quality perspective standpoint. Then what we did was we actually took measurements using the Radiant solution and the sparkle analysis algorithm to understand what that correlation perspective was. So in this slide, we presented them with display A. Display A was actually the best of the 3 displays that we shared with the 10 observers. So as you can see, they ranked it quite highly. What our measurement system did was it characterized the sparkle variation in the display and gave us a percentage value of 1.36%. Now, what does that truly mean? Well, let's look at a display that was less acceptable to the human eye. So display B had a larger amount of sparkle variation and reduced the clarity of the display quite significantly from the previous display A. So what the human observers had realized was that the quality in the display had dropped. But as you can see from a ranking perspective, you see a lot of 7s and 8s from a ranking application. When we looked at the measurement process using the Radiant system again, we ended up with a sparkle measurement value of 2.21%. So as you can see, nearly 1% higher. And that correlation shows that as the sparkle variation percentage increases, the larger amount of sparkle variation that is present in the display. As we move on to display C, you can see that the human observers realized and observed that there was a larger amount of sparkle variation, again, dropping the ranking of the display itself. And in this situation, the camera once more showed a larger percentage of sparkle variation. If you are an OEM or you're a consumer electronic manufacturer and you want to understand how to define specific tolerances, this is a way to get feedback on what's actually happening from a human perspective standpoint, but also how you can drive a tolerance standard through your different tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 channels as an example. So if I was an OEM and I was looking at basically 3 different displays, and display A and B were perceived as acceptable and quality from a human perspective standpoint, and I realized that the acceptable tolerance drop-off rate, as an example here, was 2.21%, I could set forth a limit of sparkle variation to my vendors, basically dictating what I believe they need to hit using a variety of different AG, AR, or AG coatings. This allows you to have a stronger control over the development process and ensure higher levels of quality are being achieved using the different types of films or coating technologies that are being adhered to these displays today. That said, 2.21 isn't the defined standard that Radiant suggests for all displays. This is just an example of looking at 3 separate displays at our lab and showing how a specific OEM might want to create their own internal standard for their vendors to look at and follow. So let's break down the measurement results in a little more detail. So camera to camera and camera to human vision from a repeatability standpoint. As I mentioned, one of the things that is problematic within the marketplace today with other technologies that exist is that customers have given lots of feedback to us that they see large variations from system to system, let's say camera technology to camera technology, and that it's hard to actually define appropriate standards. Radiant went through the measurement process to understand what level of variation and repeatability existed within our system platforms themselves. So we went through a measurement process where we looked at our 2 megapixel, our 8, our 16, and 29 megapixels, all using the same type of lens. So again, using the 50mm electronically controlled lens, using the same software platform, and using the same working distance. And what we wanted to understand was, is resolution a key component of looking at display sparkle variation? Is there a difference in using different types of CCDs, as an example? We looked at defining working distance, and what we found was there is variation if you change your working distance from the DUT to the camera itself, which again is the reason we've locked down the measurement methodology of using a 0.5 meter working distance. But the next couple slides will actually show you a comparison from a system repeatability standpoint of using 3 different cameras and what that variation looks like. So here we go through system repeatability. Each Radiant camera was tested for repeatability across several different displays. Here our data shows measurement results for 2 16 megapixel I16 cameras with 2 specific serial numbers. We tested the three displays that we talked about earlier, display A, B, and C, and we looked at how the results indicated that regardless of the systems we used, there was less than a 5% margin of specific error. This 5% indicates system error percentage rather than the pixel level variation that results given by a single system. So as you saw in previous slides, we output sparkle variation based on a percentage base. But when we talk about a 5% potential deviation from system to system, we're not saying that you take a measurement of a display that's emitting, let's say, 2.21% sparkle variation, and the next camera you measure is going to put you at 7.1%. If we look at a specific example, the pixel level variation, let's say, of something that had a 1% variation could result in, let's say, 0.95 or 0.105 across the measurement systems itself. So just to make that clear so that people don't assume that there's massive amounts of variation or inaccuracies from system to system. Each Radiant camera was tested over different displays. And here again, we're showing basically the results from a camera variation perspective. So if we look at display A, B, and C, we can see that we achieved less than a 5% variation. Once more, across those three different displays using a variety of different cameras. Then we get into resolution repeatability. So as I mentioned, we use the 4 different resolution cameras that Radiant actually manufactures today. So the i2, the i8, the i16, and i29. What we found that was using the same working distance and focal distance, looking at a specific display, we achieved very little variation based on a resolution standpoint, showing that resolution is not a key determining factor of characterizing sparkle. That said, if you are looking at using a Radiant solution to verify and characterize sparkle, what's nice is that this is not a one-trick pony. The system can be used for characterizing a variety of different components, which I won't go into too much in this webinar, but one thing that I want to highlight, just because sparkle variation is not reliant on resolution does not mean other types of display defects or analyses are not. So if we're looking at pixel level defects, we're looking at line defects, stuck on, stuck off, Murrah as an example, these are all different types of algorithms and analyses that the Radiant platform can use using any of the I series or Y series cameras along with the TrueTest platform. So you want to consider that when you're looking at the investment into a solution, that this is just one of many different parts of the story that make up the Radiant platform and the overall solution that we basically present to our customers. So here we actually have a snapshot of what the display itself looks like. So if we look at sparkle measurement results, we can see that we have our TrueTest platform. We have our 9 quadrants broken out, and we have basically information in our analysis results table. This information is showing once more, basically the sparkle variation and then the mean variation of the display. So here we basically blow that information up a little further, so it's a lot clearer to see. So in this situation, we had measured a specific display, we broke it out into specific quadrants, and then as you can see, number 13, we basically look at the mean value of the maximum pixel variation percentage across the display itself. So with that said, let me talk to you a little bit about something that has been quite successful for us sort of in characterizing sparkle. So we've had the benefit of working with our Konica Minolta partners in Japan last year, and we worked with a couple different OEMs at the time. And what we were able to do was we were able to create a great human correlation study. So what we did was we had this specific OEM bring in a variety of different tier 1 vendors. 10 specific automotive displays were brought in, all with different types of AG or AR coatings or films being applied to them. What the specific OEM wanted to do is they wanted to understand how the human eye can correlate to a vision-based system from a quality perspective. So what they did was they took 10 observers, similar to what we did in our lab, and they had us grade the displays 1 through 10. We basically took all the results, we mapped them out, and we graphed them in Excel. And what we saw was that basically 10 of the human observers had almost perfectly agreed on ranking the displays 1 through 10, showing that the human eye can properly perceive small amounts of variation to large amounts of variation of sparkle in a display from a quality perspective. And though that was interesting, it didn't allow us to quantify these displays from a statistical standpoint. So the specific OEM had decided that they wanted to see how the radiant system could actually correlate that information. So what we did was we took a Y-series camera, so we were only looking at the luminance layer, and we actually measured these 10 different displays in 2 different orientations, a vertical and horizontal orientation, just to show that that orientation, as long as alignment was achieved, proper alignment was achieved, that it didn't matter what the orientation of the camera was. So as we measured the 10 different displays, we got a specific sparkle variation percentage. So we took that for the 10 different displays, and then we mapped that out again. And what we did was we overlaid that information and cross-referenced it on how the radiant camera perceived the displays 1 through 10 from a sparkle variation perspective, and what the human observers thought were a quality display. So as you can see from the graph, we have nearly perfect correlation between the radiant camera in identifying what display had the lowest amount of sparkle variation to what the human observers had believed was the highest display with the lowest amount of sparkle variation from a quality perspective. This was an extremely powerful based situation where the OEM themselves had finally believed that they had found a solution that they could go forward with their different tier 1s, tier 2s, and tier 3s to define a quality standard, something that had not been possible for this OEM in the past. To the point where they actually had suggested that all of their suppliers in the room who had brought forth displays should look at using the Radiant Vision System solution or something that allowed them to get comparable results. This is an extremely strong movement and strong measurement process that with existing technologies on the market had not properly been achievable before. So as I mentioned, there was too much variation from system to system with the existing technologies, and this specific OEM had finally believed that they had found a solution that they could create individual quality standards for based on different product lines or product applications. So to summarize, anti-glare layers improve display visibility in reflective light, but as mentioned, they can also affect the perceived quality of the display. Lack of a repeatable measurement method for looking at sparkle makes it actually hard to define a quality standard process, which can make it hard for OEMs to relay the proper information and have different tier 1s and tier 2s actually adhere to that information. The method that we use at Radiant uses our imaging solutions, so either the I or Y series, our TrueTest platform, and a defined measurement criteria. This has been proven to work within the automotive and aerospace industries, and we've also been in many discussions with different types of consumer electronics applications. As mentioned again, this method allows the manufacturing, the design house, the OEM, to create precise tolerances based on sparkle variation and allow them to properly define a quality standard that previously had not been possible within the marketplace. I hope you all found this presentation quite interesting, and I look forward to seeing some of the questions come up and talking to you further about this application. Thank you. Okay, so I just saw a question. I'm just going to go with the most recent one that was just displayed. Have we ever had our instruments measure laser sparkle on projection screens to the best of our knowledge? Actually, yes. So this technology is not just used for backlit emitting displays. And although that was the focus of this talk, we actually have characterized a variety of different laser-based technologies to understand the scattering principle and the sparkling of those specific devices. So there are quite a few customers that we're currently in talks with or have been working with over the last sort of year to define that process. And I can say quite strongly that looking at lasers or looking at backlit emitting displays, there's little issue in characterizing sparkle variation, as long as you follow the same measurement methodology. Okay. Can different image colors be used to test display? Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we can actually look at, let's say, a red, a green, a blue, a white layer as an example to see how that sparkle is actually being perceived. Again, as I mentioned, green is obviously the most sensitive area of light for the human eye, so it actually makes it a lot easier from a human control perspective. But using the radiant measurement system, we obviously can characterize any emitting color. And again, whether we look at it just from the Y channel, so we're looking at just the luminance variation, or if we actually want to characterize the variation of color from a sparkle perceived scenario. Is radiant able to measure any other anti-glare effects, glare, haze, etc.? Yeah, we actually have completely separate aspects that we can use from a measurement standpoint within the TrueTest platform to characterize something like haze. We actually can define it using the same random Murrah algorithm to identify the level of haze that is present within the display. And if someone wants to have a further conversation about that, I encourage you to email us and we can open a secondary dialogue. What is the recommended number of subframes to average across the display? So that really depends on the size of the display. What's nice is the TrueTest software will actually break it out into even quadrants based on a default standard. But what we see is when we crop the display, as I mentioned earlier, let's say a 500 by 500 pixel area, the default setup is breaking it down into 9 specific quadrants. But you have the flexibility to look at how many quadrants you want to look at based on the size of your display. And again, the final results we provide you is basically the mean of the variation found in the display regardless. Can that system also be used to analyze sparkling on AR coated glass optical bonded to the display? Yeah, actually, what's really interesting about AG coatings or AR coatings is they're used across a variety of different technologies, whether we're talking about automotive cover glass or we're talking about, let's say, a windshield. We actually have the ability to characterize the sparkle variations of those coatings through those different types of glass or plastic. What's important, though, is to control the backlighting. So where I was talking about measuring a emitting green display, we just need to have a uniform light source. Again, if you could use a green emitting light source, that is ideal. And actually some of our customers in the windshield world are actually doing something very similar. But we actually have tested it with uniform white light sources, and we've been able to properly identify and characterize sparkle variation as well over those different types of glass technologies. So characterizing coatings directly over glass or plastic is very possible. Do we want to answer any more? Okay, so if you use a random Murrah on color measurements, say on a white screen, will that then break down sparkle due to color rather than luminance variations? Yeah, so, okay. So if we are characterizing it from a color perspective, we actually can look at the variation from a CX/CY perspective from a standard deviation standpoint rather than just focusing on luminance. And I think that that is your initial question, Pete. So yes, we can look at color variation and we can look at luminance variation just depending on how we select the information in the analysis itself. And I think I was just given the thumbs up that that's it for questions. I see that there are still some that have not been answered, but I'd be happy to send individual emails out to everyone who asked a question, responding to their questions and providing an accurate answer.